And today we are looking at chapter 4 of your regular NASM textbook, the pink push-up textbook. This is going to be, we call it Exercise, Metabolism, and Bioenergetics, which is obviously, it's like, what the heck are bioenergetics, you know? And it's basically going to be the study of how we turn food into work, you know? Like how does a donut become 40 lunges, you know? That's sort of a specific process. And so when we talk about our exercise metabolism, what we mean by that is we're talking about like how you're metabolizing and supplying yourself with energy during exercise. So yesterday, when we were at Sochi and we had everything kind of laid out on the whiteboard, which, oh, I just realized I didn't erase last night before I left. Crap. When we were talking about, you know, all the stuff that the different energy systems and how we spit out ATP and stuff, you know, we were looking at like moving from the ATP Pc system into glycolysis into the oxidative metabolism. You move from anaerobic into aerobic. It sort of goes in order, you know. For the record, you know, I don't think I said this last night or yesterday. It doesn't necessarily take place in perfect order the way we lay it out, although that's a much easier way to understand it. It kind of all happens all at once. Like if you're trying to wrap your head around like which came first, the chicken or the egg, you know, there really is no like perfect answer to that. The closest, the best answer I ever heard to which came first was the chicken or the egg was someone said they were like the proto chicken. And it's like, what the heck is a proto chicken? And it's like probably some half, you know, evolved chicken, you know, gave birth to an egg and then eventually grew up to be what we sort of know as a chicken. So it's like, that's what came first. So like, I feel like that about metabolism sometimes. People are like, well, when did it all start happening? What was the first like little bit of energy that we spit out? And it's like, it doesn't really go in perfect order, you know. That's kind of the miracle of life in a lot of ways. So, but we're going to kind of study it in order, and we're going to talk about how, like, as your duration changes throughout your exercise or whatever exercise it is that you're doing, your energy system is going to change, and the way you spit out energy is going to change. So, purpose of today's lesson to give you guys, and by the way, when it comes to the actual NASM test, everything we go over in the PowerPoint slides today, and you'll notice my notes are pretty much a carbon copy of the PowerPoint slides, because oftentimes the notes are meant to serve as a filter of like what's the most important stuff out of the PowerPoint. Everything in this PowerPoint's important. This is like directly out of your textbook. So when you, if you know, you'll notice there's actually a little bit less information on metabolism compared with some of the very advanced stuff that we have been talking about over the last couple of weeks. So this will be sort of a watered down version, but that watered down version is directly what they might ask you. So definitely worth a read later today. So the purpose of today's information lesson is to give you guys basic information on energy metabolism and bioenergetics that will be useful in helping you plan safe and effective workouts for your clients, right? Again, if you've got a client who is trying to get better at, you know, running a marathon, and you're training them, you know, to be really good at glycolysis, which kind of applies to bodybuilders much better, you're not really helping your athlete, you know? You're training the wrong type of energy system. And exactly the opposite is true as well. Like if you've got like, you know, an Olympic sprinter who's trying to get like more explosive, and you're training them to, you know, use their aerobic energy system, it doesn't really help them out all that much, right? It's you sort of, you know, you might be thinking, oh, I'm getting the best of both worlds, but in reality, you know, I think sometimes what comes along with the people with the mentality of like the best of both worlds is that you kind of end up with the worst of both worlds in a lot of ways. So we definitely don't want to do that. It's the jack of all trades, but the master of none situation. It's like, yeah, they're a little bit good at everything, but they're not particularly an expert at anything, you know. And for the record, there's more to that phrase. A lot of times, like you'll hear like, but it's jack of all trades, master of none, but still better than master of one, is what they'll say. That doesn't necessarily apply to our study of metabolism, but just for those of you who might be like, well, I'm a little bit good at everything. Oh, I didn't. Is this thing on timer? I swear to gosh, it just changed. 1 second, I gotta change the settings on this PowerPoint. This happens sometimes. 1 second. How do I turn off timers on PowerPoint? Where's that freaking button? Sorry guys. I don't know why this thing got reset. Oh no, I don't want a video, just show me an article. Oh my god. Transition time or duration. There it is. No. On mouse click only. All right, that should have fixed it, I think. Okay. All right, so after this presentation, I want you guys to be able to describe the primary methods about how the body actually produces energy. So we are going to be talking about our various energy systems. We want to be able to very cleanly and clearly understand the difference between the aerobic and the anaerobic energy systems, talking about like where we produce energy, whether that's in the fluid or in the mitochondria, distinguish the energy pathways that predominate for various intensities and durations. That's a really fun one. That's where it's like, hey, let's tie it to our sets. Let's tie it to our reps, and our rest period and stuff. Understand how carbs, fats, and proteins actually supply us with fuel for exercise. So we will talk about a little bit about nutrition today, which is fitting because Alexa, we were just talking a little bit about nutrition a second ago. But we'll be talking about like those things and how they actually fuel us, and like what is, which fuel are you primarily using at which times. The difference between steady state exercise and exhaustive exercise. Steady state exercise being going for a jog, and exhaustive exercise being like, HIIT interval training. Discriminate between the energy requirements of steady state versus intermittent. So we'll look at like, again, like how energy sort of works. I think I said it yesterday, but it's like you'll work in the anaerobic system and recover in the aerobic system. And then we'll describe the training adaptations for energy production. We'll talk about how your body can change the more often you do this. So bioenergetics. Bioenergetics is going to be the study of how energy is transformed through various biochemical reactions. So if you ever get like a homework question or a test question on your NASM that says blank is the study of how energy is transformed through various biochemical reactions, just remember it is bioenergetics and not metabolism. Bioenergetics is basically, again, how we take like a sandwich and we turn it into a 1 mile run. It's how we are transforming food into chemical usable energy, right? That's the bioenergetic side of things. Now, obviously, this is going to be a big part of your metabolism, which is any and all of the chemical reactions that are taking place in your body, which, we have a lot of chemical reactions in the body. But it's also going to be talking about what we call our exercise metabolism. Your exercise metabolism is actually looking at bioenergetics during the unique demands placed on the body during exercise. So there's a little bit difference between metabolism and exercise metabolism. Like metabolism is the biology term. It's the general term that we're often talking about, where it's like, it's like if it's a chemical reaction, it's part of your metabolism. Even like when a piece of pizza hits your taste buds, and you're like, oh, that's salty and greasy and delicious, right? The way you start to, responding to that salt, and then you start to break down the carbohydrates in your spit because you've got enzymes in your saliva. all of that's a metabolic reaction, right? And exactly the same thing is true, like oxygen is being, handed off from like hemoglobin to myoglobin so it can get carried over to the muscle, and enzyme is going to make that happen. That's part of your metabolism, but exercise metabolism is specifically looking at how metabolism is operating during a workout, or how your metabolism is operating in response to a workout, building muscle the next day, developing more enzymes in your blood because you did some cardio, that's what we mean. That's sort of the difference there. So your metabolism is sort of a scientific term. Your exercise metabolism is more of like a situation, and all of that is part of our conversation when we're talking about bioenergetics. So those are some definitions you might end up seeing. Definitely want to get familiar with them. Now, as we're talking about it, we are going to break down what we call substrates. Substrates is just a fancy name for the 3 macronutrients pieces, right? So like your 3 macronutrients, those are your 3 primary nutrients that you need to have every single day. And you need lots of them, right? Usually we measure macronutrients in grams. We measure micronutrients like vitamins and minerals in micro or even micrograms, so those are often like much smaller. But we need a lot of protein, we need a lot of carbohydrates, and we need a lot of lipids or fats in order to make sure that we have enough energy and enough ingredients to sort of get us through the day to produce energy, right? So our nutrients, which are those 3, proteins, fats, and carbs, are going to get broken down into their individual, what we call substrates, okay? So we've said this before, but like carbohydrates aren't going to be carbohydrates anymore. They're going to get broken down into sugars. Proteins aren't going to be proteins anymore. They're going to get broken down into amino acids. And fats aren't going to be really like a full big old fat globule anymore. Instead, they're going to get broken down into fatty acids. Okay, so we can use all 3 of those little substrates for energy. Like carbohydrates are going to be the one that we mainly talk about. Whenever we're talking about metabolizing food, the main thing we're going to talk about are carbohydrates, right? They are our body's favorite source of fuel. Now, I'm not trying to be biased towards like, having a high carb diet or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. But your body prefers to use carbohydrates when it comes to producing ATP. And we know this because, like, number one, it's the fastest, right? Also, oftentimes people have sort of a complicated relationship with carbohydrates. That's something that a lot of people tend to like really struggle with. It makes sense because your body has so many hard cravings, because it's like, oh, I want you to give me the thing that's best at spitting out lots of energy, right? And your brain in the back of your, you get your lizard brain is going like donuts, candy, like lots and lots and lots of sugar. I don't have to work to break down sugar. I can just process it for energy. bring me a candy bar, and that's sort of where we start to sort of get in trouble. And something we'll talk way more about when we get to nutrition next week. But that is very much our substrates. So we're breaking down proteins into amino acids. We're breaking carbohydrates into sugars, so those sugars can be metabolized because that's the body's favorite. And then lipids. We can actually use lipids. We can use fatty acids for energy as well. So because carbohydrates are your body's favorite source of energy, used directly for metabolizing into ATP molecules, your body will store carbohydrates in the form of what we call glycogen inside your body. So glycogen is this material that your body is actually storing. If we look at like sort of how this works, your body will keep these big long chains of carbohydrates inside your body. Look at how big and complicated a glycogen molecule is. So these are each individual little sugar molecules. That's a glucose molecule. That's a glucose molecule. That one. Let me go through the list here. No, I'm kidding. That's like the entire, big long chain. Now, there are other like carbohydrate chains out there. Obviously, we talked about like starches. a starch is a chemical structure of like a whole bunch of carbohydrates all linked together, right? So this happened last time. Why is it pulling up the low quality one or the itty bitty tiny one? Nah. Yeah. Oh, you know what? There we go. That'll work. So there we go. That's kind of a good example there. And these are different starches, right? Like there's one that kind of twists itself around, and this one sort of, creates these long chains. They look a little bit different from one another, but they're different starches, and you'll see different starches in your food. This is another thing we will talk about when we get to nutrition. But like last night, I boiled like a pot of potatoes because I was making like golden potatoes for lunch. And when you look at that, right, when you look at like, making boiled potatoes, a lot of times you'll see like that kind of scum, like float to the top of your potatoes. You get that like weird layer of stuff. That sort of scummy, weird layer that you're seeing is actually a little bit of the potatoes like breaking off and like leaking to the top. And then what's happening is they're all kind of linking together as best they can because carbohydrates are attracted to one another, right? Glucose molecules are attracted. So we see like this glucose molecule attached to that one. We might end up with something called amylose, right? What foods have amylose? Yeah, that's going to be probably something found in like corn, wheat, or rice, maybe even legumes. And then like what kind of foods have like a lot of amylopectin? Okay, so that's also going to be found in rice or like waxy potatoes. So chances are yesterday I was getting like yellow potatoes, right, which are very waxy. So what you're seeing is a lot of the amylopectin reaches up, and it's just a general starch, and there's a lot of like amylose in something like rice. When you're boiling rice, like you get that little bit of scum at the top, until it kind of gets reabsorbed back into the darn stuff. But like that is what starches are. They're these big long chains. This one over here is a little bit more complicated than this one. These big long chains of carbohydrates all linked together. Now in your body you can do the same thing. Your body can assemble a bunch of glucose molecules in a big long chain, just like that plant that you're eating, just like that potato, just like that fruit, just like that rice did as well, right? Except your body does it in kind of this big long ring that looks like this. And it's actually a little bit more complicated than your standard like carbohydrate, piece of bread or rice or, something like that. It's a little bit more complicated than that, which is part of the reason why this is going to be a little bit graphic, but has anybody in here ever gone hunting? Anybody? Oh, Simon? Nope.
I've never been.
No. So if you ever do, it's if you're an animal lover, it can be a horrifying experience. But you really don't want to, a lot of times we might think of like when we think of food, it's like, oh, I want the freshest food. You really don't want to go hunting and then like carve off like a piece of steak, and if you shot like a deer or something, you really don't want to like eat a piece of that deer today. Which sounds kind of weird, but you really don't want to do that. It'll taste very odd. It'll taste very bitter. And the reason it tastes so bitter is because that deer's muscle still has a lot of these big long chains of glycogen present in its muscle mass, because that's what glycogen is. You, me, everybody we know store glycogen primarily in our liver, but also throughout our entire muscle system as well. Your entire muscular system can actually store carbohydrates. In fact, I remember this is what percentage of body weight is glycogen? Yeah, about 4% of your body weight is glycogen. 4% of your body, guys, is stored up sugar. So when somebody tells you that you're very sweet, you can say, I'm about 4% sweet. So like you're storing these big long chains of glycogen in the body so that your body has like stored carbohydrates that it can kind of break off anytime it needs to produce a little bit of energy, right? If we took, this image here and we were just like, whoop, oh no, that's why. Yeah, it's a blank background. But if we took this little bit here and we just like broke that off and released that sugar molecule, and we release, this sugar molecule next, and then the next one, right? You've got a really good steady source of glucose coming into your bloodstream, thanks to your ability to kind of store all of this stuff and use it later. So that's one of the reasons why we know carbohydrates are so important. Now, and like I said, starches are not going to be very sweet tasting. They're usually, much duller. You think about like a sugar, like in a fruit or something, right? It tastes very sweet, right? And that's because like those big, long, complex carbohydrate chains are already broken down. They're already like split up. So when they hit your taste buds are like, great, it's already done. Send it straight into the bloodstream, right? Whereas like a big, long, complicated carbohydrate, it's going to taste a little more grainy. It's going to taste a little bit less sweet. Potato's not going to taste as sweet as like a strawberry. But it has got way more carbohydrates in it than a strawberry would because it is packed to the brim with this big, long, complicated chain. It just doesn't taste as sweet to you, even though it has more carbs in it. It doesn't taste as sweet because it's not been broken down yet. Your digestive system needs to get to it and kind of break that down. And like I said earlier, you don't really want to eat meat too quickly after it's been butchered because it may actually still have some of that glycogen present in the muscle. And it's like, it will taste very funky and very bitter because glycogen is a really big, complicated chain. The more complicated the chain is, guys, the less sweet something is going to taste in the immediate. Okay, stuff will taste sweeter the less complicated it is. The more closely it looks to a direct sugar molecule, the sweeter it's going to taste. This is one of the reasons why table sugar is so bad for us and so addicting, right? Like we all kind of have a, it's like eat one piece of candy and you're like, oh, well, maybe I'll have another one because that was really good. Your brain's going, that was an excellent source of glucose that I don't have to do any work to break down because it's basically already very, very simple. That is what we call sucrose. So sucrose, aka straight
Can
up.
I say something, Mr. Brad?
Yes.
When I say when you try one thing and it comes another and they're like more, I call it I say they're criminals. They're criminal cookies because instead of coming
sure.
one, it comes about 5 of them.
This is weird. I don't know why I pulled up an anime. Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. So what sucrose is table sugar. I'm not sure what is going on with the internet right now. Apparently there's a character named Sucrose in some anime. But sucrose looks like this. This is a molecule of glucose, which is a straight up, this is usable for energy right now, attached to a single sugar molecule called fructose found in like fruits. So when you attach those two things together, your brain goes, holy cow, that is an energy store. Bring more of that in. And, it becomes what'd you call it? A criminal cookie, right? It becomes like, it's going to like get all of its friends in there because now you want even more sweet stuff. Now, here's what's great about that is it's a ton of glucose, which means you can produce a ton of energy. What's not so great about that is because it's so simple, your body had to put in no effort to break it down. It just has to break this one single bond here versus like we saw glycogen earlier, it was a big long chain. Or we see, this big long chain right here. Like this is complicated. This takes time to break down. So when it passes into your digestive system, it goes straight into your bloodstream. Okay. Now, if it goes straight into your bloodstream, and you're in the middle of doing like some really intense work, like let's say you eat some Sour Patch Kids, which have a lot of sugar in them, obviously, and while you're in the gym, like you're in the middle of a workout, you're working really, 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 really hard. Well, because you're working so hard, your body was using that stored glycogen as its carbohydrate source. It was like, I haven't eaten in a little while. I'm going to break down the glycogen in the liver, and I'm going to break down, it's leg day. We're going to break down some of the glycogen in the legs so that I can, use that glucose for metabolized work, right? And then during your workout, you bring in like some Sour Patch Kids, your digestive system gets to work and kind of breaks it down. It doesn't work very hard because it's sugar, and so it just enters into your bloodstream, goes straight to your legs, and becomes even more glycogen. It makes it easier to break it down because you broke down the stores. But what would happen if you brought in a bunch of sugar and you're just sitting there? All you're doing is relaxing. You haven't really done very much work today. You're relaxing at home, eating Sour Patch Kids, watching a movie, Well, if that's the case, you haven't tapped into any of your glycogen stores, and you only have so much space to store glycogen in your liver and in your muscles. And you guys know what happens when your glycogen stores are full? Well, what your body will do is it'll go, okay, well, I've got all this energy that came in. I'm going to store it. Oh, I can't store it as glycogen. All right, that's okay. And it'll take that glucose molecule and it will chemically convert it. It'll metabolize it into a fatty acid. It'll turn it into what we call a triglyceride, which is a fatty acid with it's a glycerol with 3 fatty acids attached to it, right? So it will convert that sugar into a triglyceride, and then it will store that triglyceride to be used for energy later, which is what it wanted to do all along. But it didn't store it anymore as a carbohydrate. Now it is storing it as a fat cell. And that's why sugar is so very bad for us, right? Because it's so simple, it's so easy to break down. It pretty much enters your bloodstream instantly. And then your body goes, well, gosh, now I have all this sugar. So it decides to convert most of it to fat. And that's why sugar is so very bad for us. It's particularly abdominal fat, like really dangerous. Does that make sense, guys? Does everybody kind of track how that happens and why that happens?
Yes.
Cool. So that's sugar. That's sugar's deal. We don't like sugar. But we do like carbohydrates. For the record, like, I'm not anti-carb. I'm definitely anti-sugar, but I'm not anti-carb. Carbohydrates should be used directly for metabolism. The body will store carbohydrates as glycogen because it's your body's favorite source of energy. Now, another source of energy is obviously fat. Like I said, your body will also directly use fat for metabolism. It does that, by the way, if you remember, we were going through our energy systems, right? We talked about going through glycolysis. That's how we use glucose to produce ATP and lactic acid. And then eventually your body will transfer into your aerobic metabolism, your long duration, long-term sustainable energy system. That system actually can use fat to metabolize energy. It doesn't have to it can skip glycolysis, and instead it can break down fatty acids. Your body can take triglycerides and break it down, which is good. That's how we burn our fat, by the way. That's one of the ways that actually happens.
Mr. Brad, I have a question.
Yes.
Which part is this are you talking about? You're talking about the metabolism, but you were talking about doing exercise to the metabolism. So how do you do that?
Wait, what did you say?
For the extra metabolism, you say you can do an exercise to it. So what kind of exercise would you do?
I'm gonna get there. We'll come back to that. Yeah. That's gonna happen at the end of the lesson. I'll talk about how you can boost your metabolism. Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool.
But for right now, you can burn fat, right? Like, fat is a fuel source. So fat can be used as a fuel source in the aerobic part of your metabolism. But remember, we talked about this yesterday. The aerobic part of your metabolism is the low intensity part of your metabolism. So while it does primarily rely on fat as a fuel source, it doesn't burn as many calories, right? So like, you may be like do like some fake math here, we'll just throw some numbers out. Let's say you're burning 50% fat, you're burning 50% fat, 50% carbs of 100 calories, right? Or I'm sorry, let's make that 200 calories worth of energy. So you're burning 200 calories worth of energy, 50% of it is fat, 50% of it carbs. That's 100 calories of fat. So you lost 100 calories worth of fat in your body, and you lost 100 calories worth of carbs in your body. Now, let's say your intensity goes up and you spend most of your time in glycolysis, you might only be burning 20% fat, which is not very much fat. Most of what you're bringing 80% carbohydrates. You might be going, well, that's not good. I don't want to burn, carbs. I want to lose my body fat, right? But here's the thing. You're probably going to burn way more calories. Let's say you're burning 1,000 calories per hour instead of 200 calories per hour. Well, now that means that like 20% of 1,000 is 200 fat calories, right? Whereas before it was 50%. So it was a higher percentage, but it was still less fat overall. That's what we're going to talk about at the end of today's lesson. So your body does like to use fat as a fuel source, but it likes to use it for slow, sustained energy burn. You guys right now, everybody, are burning fat for fuel. That's your body's preferred fuel source right now because your intensity is very low. Alexia, I can see you're sitting down driving a car, right? I'm assuming the rest of you guys are probably sitting. I don't know, Chris, you might be at the gym. I feel like I always catch you at the gym. But like, it's a little bit, depending on your intensity level. Like for the most part, we're resting right now. Your body's burning fat for fuel. And you might be thinking, well, that's great. I want to burn fat for fuel. Yeah, but you're not burning very many calories per hour, right? So the percentage is higher, but the effort is low. And that's where we kind of need to match those things. And like I said, Alexia, that's what we're going to get to at the very end of the lesson. So those are our two primary sources of fuel. Now, the third source of fuel is protein. Protein can also be used to produce energy, but it is your body's least favorite way to produce energy. Your body will try its hardest not to produce energy from protein. And the way it does it, it produces this energy by breaking down the amino acids. So you remember how I said like glucose is, glycogen is a big long chain of glucose molecules, right? All carbohydrates are. Carbohydrates are big long chains of glucose in various shapes, right? Which gives us our various types of carbohydrates. And then fats are big long chains of like fatty acids all linked together, right? Well, proteins are big long chains of amino acids. Now, an amino acid is too complicated to be able to produce energy. Your body can't use an amino acid directly to produce energy. It just doesn't have the tools necessary to do it, okay? So how the heck do we produce energy out of something like a protein? Well, let's look at an amino acid here. Let's take a look at what an amino acid looks like. So this is a general amino acid, right? You can see here. I'm gonna open that up and let's take a look at a glucose. Pull up a picture of glucose here. And let's pull up a picture of a fatty acid. All right, so here's our main ingredients, right? Take a look, guys. If you look at carbohydrates, right, it's a little bit of carbon. There's the C, right? One, well, there's more than just the one, but there's, I think, 6. But there's your little carbon, right? And then here's an H, a little bit of hydrogen, right? And then a little bit of oxygen, right? So carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are the 3 ingredients that make up all carbohydrates, all glucose, right? Close that. We take a look over here at our fatty acid, right? Look, hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. Lots of carbon in the middle. Lots of hydrogen around the outside. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon. Same 3 ingredients. Fats and carbohydrates are basically the same when it comes to like what they're made of. They're just arranged differently, which is why those 2 things can be used for energy. Now, take a look at this protein. Take a look at this amino acid here, right? A little bit of hydrogen, little bit of oxygen, a little bit of carbon. Those are the same three ingredients we just saw. But you will also notice this N right here. That is a little bit of nitrogen. And then you'll also see this, when this R here, there isn't an R on the periodic table, I don't think, unless it's like right on. Is there an R? Oh, rhenium. Got it. So I guess there is an R, but that's not what this is. This isn't actually an element right here. This is what we call a side chain or an R group. And it's just basically kind of a blank canvas for, there's going to be a more of like a bigger, longer chain within this section. This is meant to represent a general amino acid. If we were to zoom in the R group, we'd see there'd be 20 variations of how this R can look, and they would still be hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, and oxygen. So the four things that make up an amino acid are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Those are the same three things: glucose, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Same thing, fat, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Same three ingredients. So it has everything it needs to produce energy, but it's gumming up the works with this guy right here, nitrogen. This little bit of nitrogen is what gives amino acids their very unique shapes, which is amazing, and we're super thankful for it. It's awesome. It's how we make proteins, because they can form themselves in these really cool coils and shapes. And, you know, hemoglobin, your DNA, and your muscle cells and your skin cells are all made out of the same 20 ingredients, and they all look totally different from one another. That is amazing. So we are super grateful for nitrogen, but when it comes to energy production, it's gumming up the works. You know, it's like you're fueling up your car and you're just putting a little bit of extra sand in there. You know, like, don't do that. You know, you're like, oh no, I guess we're talking about proteins here. You're fueling up your car and then you're pouring a little bit of like chicken stock in there as well. Don't do that. You know, that's not good for your car. So I'm no expert on cars, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. That will gum up the works. And that is the problem with using protein for energy. So your body really tries not to, right? The third fuel source is protein, but protein is very rarely used to supply you with energy, especially for exercise. Now, I say that it's rare, but for the record, it can still happen. But because that nitrogen is gumming up the works and it's slowing everything down, it's in the way, the only way that your body is going to be able to use an amino acid for energy is it needs to get rid of that nitrogen. And the nitrogen is what gives an amino acid its skeleton. It's what gives an amino acid its shape. But what your body will do is it will use this process right here. You guys are going to want to be familiar with this term. It will go through this process that we call gluconeogenesis. Okay, so neogenesis, well, genesis is the production of something, right? And then like neo is sort of like a level above. It's like a metagenesis, you know, which really all that means, all it's saying is like your body is the one synthesizing this. It's generating this thing because it has to. And then it's making glucose, right? So we call it gluconeogenesis. It's the formation of glucose. Your body will make a carbohydrate from non-carbohydrate sources. So what gluconeogenesis does is it takes a molecule of, it takes an amino acid and it grabs the nitrogen and rips it out. It literally removes the nitrogen skeleton from an amino acid. And then all it does is it just reshapes it, and suddenly you are left with a molecule of glucose. And then you can metabolize glucose for energy. This is actually what all carnivores do. When you think about like energy production, we all come from, you know, we all have the same working parts if we're out there, right? All the animals on the planet, we all have the same working parts. We're all producing aerobic and anaerobic energy in different ways. And you know, the body, everybody's body prefers to use glucose as a fuel source. But there are carnivores out there, like strict carnivores, you know, like lions and tigers, cats. Your house cat, you know, is strictly a carnivore. Your cat is not an omnivore. For the record, like if you have a vegan cat, you your cat's in trouble. It's not going to do well. Again, I'm not anti-vegan, but like I'm certainly anti-vegan cat. Dogs, they can get away with it. Dogs are, they're omnivores like us. They can eat a combination. And cats, all carnivores actually do rely on gluconeogenesis. The weird thing about that is that carnivores are kind of inefficient in that way. They still use carbohydrates for energy, even though they don't eat carbohydrates. They eat protein and then they convert that protein into carbohydrates. Now that sounds great, right? All you have to do is rip the nitrogen skeleton out. I always picture like Mortal Kombat. It's like, like rip the nitrogen skeleton out, and then all you're left with is glucose. Now you can produce energy with that. Cool, right? No problem. Well, there's a little bit of a problem. Like, there's just a little bit of fuss. And that's the fact that like that nitrogen's got to go somewhere. So it ends up just kind of building up in your body, has to go through your kidneys to get filtered out. And then eventually it can, your body's going to pee it out and it won't be a problem after that. But your body did have to filter it. This is where, if you ever hear you'll read articles on the internet that say like high protein diets are bad for your kidneys. They're hard on your kidneys. That's not 100% true. If your kidneys are functioning really well and they're fine, it's not really going to cause you too many problems. But if you do have kidney problems in any capacity, and you have like a really, really high protein diet and your body starts converting excess proteins into carbohydrates, and then you're left with all this extra nitrogen, your kidneys have to filter that out. You could maybe struggle filtering all that nitrogen out. And when that happens, it builds up in your blood. And when that happens, it starts to gum up some of your other metabolic activities, because there's just too much nitrogen present. It can raise your pH levels. And remember, our body operates at a very narrow range of temperature, right? Like we really only operate from like 97 to like 99 degrees well, and then we go beyond that or below that and we start to struggle metabolically. Your metabolism starts to like shut down and it doesn't work as well. Well, the same thing is true with your pH levels. We operate at a pretty narrow range of pH. And when you become very, 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 very acidic, because there's excess nitrogen or ketone bodies or stuff like that in your blood, it can start to cause a little bit of havoc. It's probably fine for the most part for most people. But if you're on like a keto diet, or if you're on like a carnivore diet, something that is extremely low in carbohydrates, it's very important to make sure that, you're talking with your doctor, do a blood test every 6 months, just make sure you're getting a regular old checkup. Just keep in touch to make sure that like your doctor's testing your levels and like, yeah, your liver, your kidneys, they're both in good shape. Cool. If that's the case, move on, keep living your life. If your doctor's like, oh, your kidneys are having a little bit of a hard time keeping up with your protein intake, you might want to consider, altering your diet and stuff. So that's gluconeogenesis. So gluconeogenesis is the formation of glucose from amino acids. Your body tries not to. Your cat loves it. Our body's trying not to do that. So those are our three main substrates. Those are our three sources of fuel. Any questions on those, or is any of that not clear? Gluconeogenesis, any of that stuff? How's everybody feeling?
Good.
Oh, we got a lot of radio silence today, guys. All right, so let's take a look at the energy production stuff. So again, the whole reason we're doing all this is because we're trying to create molecules of ATP, right? We're back to the energy production stuff. So we look at ATP, we look at its chemical structure. It actually looks like this. You can see hydrogen, oxygen. nitrogen. So it's very similar to a protein and very similar to a carbohydrate, but it also has like little bits of phosphorus in there, and that's where all the energy is actually. Those are the three phosphates, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this one here. So here's the molecule of adenosine. Now, normally you'll see me kind of draw this as like a circle, right? Normally, and that's kind of how I feel, because like adenosine is actually two things coming together. It's actually this sugar called ribose, which is very similar to sugars that you would eat in your diet. That's the ribose right there. And then adenine is actually an is very similar to an amino acid. So you've got adenine plus ribose, that's a protein plus a sugar, and then you get the three phosphates here. So what we're going to do, what we're going to do is we're going to take this third phosphate and kick it off, right? That kicking off, that breaking of the chemical bond is what's going to release all of our energy, right? All that energy is going to get released thanks to doing that. Our cells are going to capture that energy, and all of a sudden we are doing lots and lots and lots and lots of work. This was adenosine triphosphate. Now it's adenosine diphosphate, tri for 3, 1, 2, 3, di for 1, 2, right? So now it's adenosine diphosphate. For the record, your body can break this chemical bond as well. Let's say like you're in a really bad energy situation. Your body can actually kick that phosphate off and break that bond, but it releases a little bit of energy, like not quite as much. Well, it's a smaller lightning bolt. And actually, your body can break this bond as well. It can kick off this phosphate. And then you're left with AMP, adenosine monophosphate. But your body doesn't like doing it. It's really inefficient. In fact, a lot of people theorize, there's not a lot of study on this, but a lot of people theorize that breaking down AMP is one of the reasons we end up with smaller type 1 muscle fibers. It interrupts muscle growth. It actually sort of gums up the works when it comes to hypertrophy, which is one of the reasons they think marathoners who are, they need so much energy, they start breaking, they've run out of ATP. So then their body goes, all right, well, we'll break down ADP. And then they're left with that AMP, adenosine monophosphate. They start breaking that down, and it actually prevents their muscles from growing. Theoretically, do not quote me on that. You are definitely not going to be tested on it. But that is sort of a working theory that's running around right now. So that's ATP, right? It's adenosine triphosphate. It's one of the primary sources of immediate cellular energy, right? So we store the energy in chemical bonds. The energy to perform work is trapped within the bond of that final phosphate. Our body is going to break that phosphate and release all that energy. And then our body is going to capture that energy in order to do stuff like muscle contractions or, creating a new molecule of something from DNA, making new muscle mass, or maybe it's, processing a thought or an action. And then afterwards, like I said, we are left with adenosine diphosphate, or ADP, and has to find a way to reattach that final phosphate if it's going to create more ATP. Now, how do we reattach that how do we get that third phosphate reattached? Well, like I said yesterday, that's where the Atp Pc system comes in. This provides energy for short duration, high intensity work. It replenishes ATP really, really, really rapidly. This can last about 6 to 10 seconds. Remember yesterday I wrote like 5 to 10 seconds? And I said, like, don't quote me on any of these numbers because every scientist disagrees on how long this stuff takes. This is what I was talking about, right? Here's glycolysis. Now it says 30 to 50 seconds instead of 30 to 60, like I said. The numbers are going to fluctuate just a little bit depending on who you ask. We are still, figuring metabolism out. But ATP PC is your short duration, high intensity work. This is usually associated with your maximal intensity lifts. When I say like 1 to 5 repetitions, right? That's a maximal intensity, super difficult lift, right? So that's where it starts. Your first maybe 5 reps, might be using primarily the ATP Pc system. And the way that that works is basically your body uses little phosphocreatines to reattach the ATP molecule. And we'll look at that in just 1 second. The next energy system, let's say you move on beyond 10 seconds, you move into second number 11, and maybe you start doing about 30 seconds worth of work, right? Maybe, a higher number of repetitions. Well, now you're getting into glycolysis. Glycolysis is going to provide energy by breaking down glucose to spit out ATP. So like the ATP Pc system just reattach phosphates using enzymes to produce a massive amount of energy really quickly, but not for very long duration. Well, glycolysis is going to be like, all right, well, we got to start breaking down glucose. So it starts breaking up the glucose, and it does that to spit out the new ATP. So it provides energy through the breakdown of glucose to create ATP for moderate intensity, moderate duration work. We're thinking like 30 to 50 seconds. If you were incredible at glycolysis, if you have really big muscles and you trained for it and you're really good at glycolysis, you might actually last up to 2 minutes in glycolysis, but generally we think 30 to 50 seconds. I say 30 to 60. I think it's a little easier to understand. This is usually associated with moderate intensity exercise. That's 6 to 12 reps. So we have our high intensity exercise, we have our medium intensity exercise, and then we have our oxidative metabolism, which is the most complex, and that uses the substrates. Remember, a substrate is like a broken down, like substrate of glucose is, substrate of carbohydrates is glucose, substrate of protein is amino acids. Well, the substrate of glycolysis is lactic acid. So this is the most complex. It uses the substrates and a little bit of extra oxygen from glycolysis to spit out ATP. And this is anything greater than 2 minutes in duration. So 12 to 20 repetitions or doing cardio, all of that is a very good example of the oxidative energy system. And here is everything I just said laid out in sort of a chart form, right? Take a look at this picture here. What these lines represent is the percentage of energy that is coming from the energy system. So the red system is like in your first 10, look at how short this little bar is here. In the first 10 seconds, your ATP Pc system is doing all the work. It's like, I got this. It looks really heavy. It's super explosive. And it lasts a whole 10 seconds. And then it's like your ATP is just drained. Your ATP Pc system just can't do any more work. So then what starts to happen is glycolysis has had enough time to ferment some of those pyruvates, spit out, break down that glucose and spit out some energy. So now glycolysis has taken over for the ATP Pc system, and it is supplying you with most of the energy. And that can last, you'll notice, like we said, 30 to 50 seconds. And look, this line goes up to 2 minutes, and then it starts to die. Again, these numbers fluctuate a little bit, and you got to just kind of take them as fluctuating numbers. But you can see it's like, oh, glycolysis is doing most of the work until about here. Then you notice like this yellow line is starting to pick up, right? And then it kind of dies off. It doesn't, like the ATP Pc, look, it died all the way. It's like, man, I ain't doing anything anymore. Glycolysis kind of keeps moving in the background. Meanwhile, the entire time all of this has been happening, your aerobic energy system has started to kind of kick in. And it's, now we're reaching the 2 minute mark, now we're reaching the 5 minute mark. Your aerobic system, your oxidative metabolism, is really supplying you with most of the energy for any of that long duration stuff. So glycolysis is happening in the background, but it's not doing most of the work. Most of the work is coming from your oxidative metabolism. So that's sort of a different way of looking at this. Rather than just memorizing 6 to 10 seconds, 30 to 50 seconds, or greater than 2 minutes. There's a chart that kind of represents that. But that's where all the energy is coming from in general. So let's break these systems down and get to a place where we can really understand them. I do want to show you a video before we get into that. So here is the difference between your anaerobic and your aerobic energy systems, your oxidative metabolism versus glycolysis, right? So here's a little video that's going to kind of break this down for us. Not my normal crash course video. This isn't my favorite, but it's not bad.
If you have ever picked up a weight and began doing repetitions, you'll know that your first rep and your last rep are drastically different. During the first rep, you'll feel full of energy, but by the last one, it is as though the energy has just run out. To understand why this is, you need to understand the energy that powers a muscle contraction. The food we eat, the air we breathe, these are definitely components, but the actual process is a little more complicated. Understanding it, though, will give you a significant advantage over the average bro who trains. A muscle contraction requires the muscle cells to have energy. In our bodies, this energy is stored in a specific molecule called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. ATP is a large molecule, not to mention it is unstable in water, which is bad news since we are made mostly of water. ATP makes up for these drawbacks, though, through the fact that if the third phosphate chain is released, it provides the power for a muscular contraction. Because it is a large and unstable molecule, our muscles can only store enough to power 5 to 10 seconds worth of contraction before they run out. Since only 10 seconds of ATP is stored, the body has 3 generation systems which work in real time to keep these levels topped off. Powering these generation systems and stored in your muscles is a more stable molecule, glucose. It is this glucose which the first generation system turns into ATP, along with some byproducts. Then, the other 2 generation systems turn those byproducts from the first generator into more ATP. One of my favorite shows is The Grand Tour on Amazon. In the season 1 finale, James May drove a hybrid BMW i3, which is actually a great analogy for this system. The car is powered by electricity, which is stored in a battery. The car can store a limited amount of electricity in this battery, just like your body can only run on ATP and stores a limited amount. Once this runs out, a diesel generator built into the car provides a slow stream of electricity back into the battery. Think of this like your body turning glucose into ATP through its 3 primary systems. The car can't run directly on the diesel, just as you can't run directly on the glucose. It must first turn the diesel into usable energy, electricity, or in our cases, ATP. The main difference, though, is where James May's car has just 1 generator, your body has 3 generation systems which are simultaneously working to keep these ATP levels topped up. Later on, it will become very important to understand that each of these generation systems also operates at a different speed.
As a personal trainer, what's the best way to confidently walk away from your in-person training job at a gym?
So hopefully you're following so far. The muscles have a limited supply of ATP. 5 to 10 seconds later, it's all gone. Think of the ATP supply as a laptop with a really terrible battery life. This is why the 3 ATP generation systems of the body are so important to keep the ATP battery topped off. The first generator runs on that glucose that is stored and available in the muscles. Through something called glycolysis, the muscle is able to create 4 ATP molecules from a molecule of glucose using 2 molecules of ATP which it already has. The process is the fastest of the 3. There are also some byproducts left over, which will be exploited later on by the other 2 generators to create even more ATP. Left over are 2 pyruvate molecules and 2 NADH molecules. Now onto the other 2 generators, which, unlike the first one, the other 2 require oxygen to operate. If oxygen is present, these two systems can run. The pyruvates can be broken down into 2 more ATPs and even more NADH molecules through the Krebs cycle. This cycle operates at a slower rate than glycolysis, and like I said, very important, it requires oxygen. Then, the third element, the electron transport chain, with the help of oxygen, is able to turn all of these NADHs into even more ATP, such that one very efficient cell in the third step can create 34 ATPs. This is the slowest of the 3 processes and once again requires oxygen. So out of just one stable molecule of glucose in the muscles, our muscle cells have derived 38 molecules of ATP. With these 3 processes working simultaneously, a continuous supply of energy is available. Different macronutrients we consume slot into these processes in different places. Only glucose can be used for the first process of glycolysis. However, fat can be turned into glucose within the liver, or else ketogenic diets wouldn't work. Protein, however, must be broken down into amino acids and can only enter into the second process. Imagine that you are walking at a slow pace. There is a certain ATP burn rate demanded by your muscles to fuel this walking pace. As you speed up though, so does the ATP requirement, just like James May's car accelerating. But remember, unlike James May's car, which has 1 generator, our bodies have 3, each operating at different speeds. As you increase the ATP demand, eventually you'll hit a point where you burn ATP at a faster rate than the slowest generation process can keep up with. The limiting factor? Remember how I said the final 2 processes require oxygen? Well, if your body is unable to deliver oxygen quickly enough, these processes can't work and you'll feel out of breath, as your body struggles to keep the Krebs cycle and electron transport chains running. Remember the first process, glycolysis? Well, if you remember, it didn't require oxygen, so it keeps chugging along for a little while. But it also only yields 2 ATPs. What puts a stop to our last remaining ATP generator? Well, as you remember, glycolysis had byproducts. Normally, the other 2 generators would use these byproducts. But in the absence of enough oxygen, these generators turned off, so the byproducts begin to build up. When the byproducts aren't being used by the other 2 generators, your cells need to get rid of them quickly, so they turn them into something you have probably heard of before, lactic acid. As the lactic acid builds up, it eventually becomes too detrimental, and the last remaining generator is forced to stop producing ATP, and your car body stops. This is the essence of aerobic versus anaerobic. When you're operating aerobically, you're operating in the presence of oxygen at a slow enough ATP burn rate that all 3 generators are running. Once your ATP burn exceeds the metabolic threshold, the other 2 generators can't get enough oxygen and the burn rate becomes unsustainable. When we are running on just the generator that doesn't require oxygen, we are operating anaerobically. The good news is that this metabolic threshold can change. As you train to improve your cardio, you can increase the burn rate, which your body can sustain aerobically, as your body becomes more efficient at delivering oxygen to the muscles. I hope I was able to explain that in a way that made sense. It's a complicated topic, but it doesn't have to be.
It is a pretty complicated
Until next
topic.
time.
So let's kind of go ahead and work our way through that, right? So like I said, we're going to start with the ATP Pc system, okay? This is the stored ATP that you have available to yourself. It only lasts 5 to 10 seconds. In the video, he called it the laptop with a really bad battery. For the record, it's a really good battery. We're really grateful for our ATP Pc system, but it does only last a little while. So what the ATP Pc system is it's energy within the ATP molecule is going to help us create the contraction. The Pc system part of it stands for phosphocreatine. So what your body does is your body will use hydrolysis, will use water to regenerate ATP by giving a phosphate from a molecule of creatine back on, and it'll reattach the phosphate there, right? So if we look at that, this is what it sort of looks like. You can see here is the original ATP molecule that we broke down, right? Just like I've got in my picture here, right? Now we've got ADP, that's adenosine diphosphate. We don't have this third phosphate over here, but now what we do have is we have a molecule of creatine, right? So we have ADP plus a little bit of creatine here. Now you'll notice creatine has a little phosphate there, right? So what'll happen is it'll use its enzyme. That enzyme is called creatine kinase, and it'll spit off the creatine part. Actually, you know what? Let's see here. Can I copy? Let's see here. So what it'll do is it will actually take the creatine molecule from here, and it will split off its phosphate. It'll pull that away and reattach it. And now it can be used as ATP again, but you're left with a little bit of extra creatine. You're also left with just a little bit of water as well. So a little bit of creatine plus H2O there, right? And this is one of the reasons why you get a little bloated when you use like creatine as a supplement. It leaves a little bit of water in your system. But this is great. Like, look, we've got extra ATP now, right? So we can create even more energy. So that's the ATP Pc system. Like I said, you can only do this for about 5 to 10 seconds. If you take creatine as a supplement, maybe you get 11, 12 seconds out of it. It's not going to be a huge difference, but you know, it can be helpful. So the enzyme responsible, we call that creatine kinase. This is high intensity exercise, relies primarily on the ATP Pc system. We think of like heavy weightlifting or super explosive gymnastics or like really explosive sprinting, right? That's very much relying on the ATP Pc system. Like, let's look at you know, let's look at that's a pole vaulter. Is that right? Not pole vaulting. Impressive vault gymnast. There we go.
Over the last 2 months, I've lost about 20 pounds, which blows my mind.
After 3 months, I've actually...
So you look at something like this. This is nuts. You hit this freaking thing. Poof! Look at how short their event is, right? They're being as explosive as possible. You know, sprinting like crazy. Let's see how long this takes. So she's at the starting line. This is gymnast in a nutshell, you know. 26-second marker. And the event is over at the 34-second marker. So that was 8 seconds. Her whole event, but it was really explosive. I mean, I'm not going to spring off a board that high. That is very much what we think of when we think of the ATP Pc system. It's very explosive. We could also look at like, you know, you look at like Eddie Hall deadlift record. You know, here's Eddie Hall lifting 1,102 pounds. Halfthorne Bjornsson, the mountain broke his record, by the way. I think he lifted like 11 pounds or something. But still, this is the original record. Also, he did it at a competition. Bjornsson didn't, but so here we go. We're gonna grab 1,102 pounds. That is insane. He's doing it barefoot. He's got full lockout. and he's done, his entire nervous system shuts down. But like, there you go. There's his entire sport over. You know, he's not playing 40 minutes on the field, you know. That's it. That's the event, you know. So that's the ATP Pc system. It's really explosive, it's really intense, it's really short. Now, the glycolytic system, or glycolysis, is the metabolic process that actually converts glucose into ATP. It converts it into pyruvic acids as well. And those pyruvates, that pyruvic acid, is going to be really important when we talk about our oxidative metabolism. But for right now, let's take a look at the glucose, right? So 1 molecule of glucose will net you 2 molecules of ATP, which is what I always say. Now, in the video, you might be thinking back and going, wait a minute, he said that you get 4 molecules of ATP through glycolysis. And that actually is true. But it actually, here's what's weird about glycolysis. It actually takes energy to get it started. So it actually uses 2 molecules of glucose, and then you are left with a remaining 2 that you produce. If you want to make a little bit of money, you got to spend a little bit of money, you know. So it spends 2 and makes 4, that nets us 2. So we end up with 2 molecules of ATP, and then we end up with a little bit of NADH or NAD. And that's going to become really important in just a minute. That NAD will be converted into pyruvic acid as well, which eventually leads to lactic acid if it sticks in that non-oxygen environment. But those byproducts, those pyruvates, when they ferment, drop into our last energy system, which is the oxidative side of things. So let me show you another little video here. This is actually a really old school video. This is actually a very good explanation. It's just the video is a million years old. Let's see here. There we are. All right, so forgive this old video. Where's my volume?
While ATP is the fuel that supplies the energy for muscles to work, unlike some other types of fuel you might be familiar with, it's not a case of simply filling up the body's tank with ATP and off we go. In fact, the body has 3 different energy systems, and they all work together to enable our muscles to contract and allow us to perform an incredible range of movements. The first 2 energy systems we'll examine are called anaerobic energy systems. That is, they function without oxygen. Firstly, the Atp Pc system. Pc stands for phosphocreatine. Let's look more closely at an ATP molecule. Its molecular diagram looks like this. When the energy from an ATP molecule is released, one of the phosphate groups, consisting of 1 phosphorus atom and 3 oxygens, splits away. The remaining molecule is known as ADP, or Adenosine Diphosphate. Its molecular diagram looks like this. But when Pc, or phosphocreatine, which is also found in muscle cells, reacts with ADP, it donates a phosphate group to the ADP molecule, and an ATP molecule is again formed. When Pc gives off its phosphate group, a molecule known as creatine is left. For this reaction to take place, an enzyme called Creatine Kinase must be present. This series of reactions is the basis of the ATP Pc energy system. ATP synthesizes to ADP and resynthesizes to ATP with the help of Pc molecules and the enzyme. These reactions take place very quickly inside the muscles. And because PC is stored in the muscles, it is the first energy system used during high-intensity physical activity. The muscles only store about 10 seconds worth of PC, so any physical activity that involves quick, short bursts of energy makes heavy use of the ATP Pc system. When the 10 seconds worth of PC is used up, muscles start relying on the second anaerobic energy system for the bulk of their energy. This second anaerobic energy system is known as the lactic acid system. It works by synthesizing new ATP molecules from glycogen, which is the stored form of sugar in our bodies. The reaction is known as glycolysis, and because it doesn't involve oxygen, it's called anaerobic glycolysis. Through a complex series of reactions, glycogen breaks down into ATP and lactic acid. This anaerobic glycolysis occurs when muscles are working above their lactate threshold, something we'll look at in more detail later in the program. As lactic acid builds up in our muscles, they begin to hurt and feel stiff, and this serves as a signal that our muscles are wanting a rest. Anaerobic glycolysis is the basis of the lactic acid energy system. During high-intensity exercise, it takes about 10 seconds to really kick in and lasts about another 20 seconds or so before the third system starts to play the most important part in providing muscles with the energy they need.
So that's the anaerobic side of things, right? Again, we are going to break down glucose. We end up with lactic acid. We also end up with ATP. And we use that for energy, and that's pretty intense, right? That supplies us with a good amount of fast energy, which means that we're going to lift relatively heavy. But if we want to lift longer duration, well, that's where the oxidative metabolism comes in. So this is where we have, like I said, it's the most complicated, your oxidative system, because there's three things taking place. Now, the first one we hardly ever talk about. The first one is aerobic glycolysis. It's the same as regular glycolysis, except this is taking place inside the mitochondria of our cells. It's still the same process. It just happens like most of the time when we're talking about glycolysis, we're talking about producing energy. Here's a big cell and here's a mitochondria. Most of the time we're talking about glycolysis in all this white section here, but your body can do just a little bit of aerobic glycolysis inside the wall here, inside the mitochondria. So it can still do that, just, we don't talk about it because it honestly is the same as regular glycolysis. But then you have the Krebs cycle. Now the Krebs cycle is going to rely on those byproducts. Remember, we talked about creating a little bit of ATP, we talked about creating a little bit of NAD, and we talked about creating a whole bunch of pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid is going to ferment in that fluid to go into the Krebs cycle and kick off a whole bunch of energy there. So that's where we get a little bit of energy. But then it actually can't really use that energy because most of that energy is going to be very similar to what we created earlier, the NAD, right? And a little bit of what's also called FAD, F-A-D. So we get a little bit more ATP in the Krebs cycle. We get to about 2 more molecules, and we get a bunch of NAD and a bunch of FAD. NAD and FAD are going to go through the final bit, the electron transport chain, which is right over here. If you look at your, this is your mitochondria here. There's a little pump at the very end, right over here, that squeezes all the NAD and all the FAD. It squeezes it all together to spit out ATP, spits out a whole bunch, right? This Krebs cycle takes place. So aerobic glycolysis happens just on this side, citric acid cycle happens here in the middle, and then electron transport chain is a little pump at the very end. The pump looks like this, by the way. Let me show you just so you can see it. It's called ATP Synthase is what the pump is called, or it's more commonly referred to as AT paste. Looks something kind of like this. So they basically NAD and FAD go in through the top here and spits out a whole bunch of ATP by squeezing those together. So that's your oxidative metabolism. Now, like I said, your body can also use fat as a fuel source here. Fat can also be metabolized, but it has to be aerobically. It has to do this through what is called beta oxidation, okay? So beta oxidation is going to break down fats and kick it straight over to the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, okay? So let's watch our final video today. I know I'm videoing it up like crazy today, but here's the aerobic side of things. Oxidative metabolism.
The aerobic energy system works by supplying oxygen to the muscles. This is the most complex of the three energy systems and requires the heart, lungs, and whole circulatory system to work. After about 30 seconds of intense physical activity, the aerobic energy system becomes the main source of energy. It is at this point that large quantities of oxygen carried by the blood becomes available to the muscles. The presence of available oxygen to the muscles allows a process known as aerobic glycolysis to take place. This process uses the large stores of glycogen in the body, which is synthesized into ATP. Water and carbon dioxide are byproducts, which the muscle cells expel via the blood. This expulsion of the waste products prevents muscles from becoming fatigued in a short period of time. With the heart and lungs working harder to move greater volumes of oxygenated blood around the body, aerobic energy allows the muscles to keep on working and working. As well as using glycogen as the basis for ATP synthesis, the aerobic energy system can also use the body's fat. However, this requires large amounts of oxygen, so for moderate to intense physical activity, glycogen is the preferred source of ATP. But after about 2 hours of continuous aerobic activity, glycogen is all used up and fat takes over as the source of ATP synthesis. Marathon runners say they can detect when this occurs in the body and refer to reaching that point as hitting the wall. Because greater amounts of oxygen are used in breaking down fat, less is available to working muscles, and athletes must rest or slow down. In extreme events, such as famine, body fat can also become totally used up, and protein then becomes the source of ATP synthesis. The aerobic energy system requires heart, lungs, and circulatory system to provide oxygen to muscles. Aerobic glycolysis synthesizes ATP from glycogen. Water and CO2 are byproducts, which leave the cells via blood flow. The aerobic system becomes the dominant energy source after about 30 seconds of intense activity and can sustain around 2 hours of continuous aerobic activity. After this point, fat becomes the main source of ATP synthesis.
So, all right, let's so that is basically all of that. Now let's tie this up to the gym, because Alexia, you asked earlier, right? You're like, how do you increase your fat burn, right? That was the question from earlier, and I was like, we're gonna get there. This is where it shows up. So now that we have a pretty good understanding of all that, here's how you guys can train for that. So when we look at energy during exercise, one of the things you got to remember about this that's kind of weird is that energy has a sort of inverse relationship with intensity. So intensity and duration they have an inverse relationship, right? So if this is duration, so if your duration is pretty short, well, your intensity can be pretty high, which is good, right? Like that means that like, oh, okay, well, as long as I, if I want to work really, really hard, I need to make sure I'm working as hard as I can for a short duration. This is kind of what I was talking about last night when I said like a marathon is hard, but it's not intense, right? So duration and intensity have an inverse relationship. If your intensity goes up, your duration is going to have to come down. Makes perfect sense when you think about it in terms of repetitions, right? If I lift for, my 1 rep max, how many reps can I do? 1. If I can do more than 1 rep, it's not my 1 rep max anymore. That means that like I have gotten stronger and the intensity has gone down for me, which is great. It's like, wow, I'm just better at the exercise. So as intensity climbs, your duration will fall and vice versa, right? So your body will play a big role in how much energy is being used for various things, right? The amount of energy from stored ATP is relatively short. That's got to be the highest intensity and lowest duration. But the energy from from fat is essentially unlimited. Your body has so much fat store. Even if you have a low body fat percentage, there are so many calories worth of energy found within your fat stores. And so your body can metabolize that very slowly, but produce like lots of energy, right? So here's the thing. We know that there's a couple things that are going to affect how we burn calories based on how many muscles you are using simultaneously. Body position is a big part of this. We know that laying down burns less energy than sitting upright. And we also know that sitting upright burns less energy than standing. So let's say you need to choose between, let's take a look here. Let's say we need to choose between a seated shoulder press machine. Right, so there's a seated shoulder press machine. Let's go, actually, no, that's perfect. Let's say we're gonna choose like a standing shoulder press. Yes, and let's say we do a single leg standing shoulder. Something like this. So if we look at these different exercises, right? This first one, he's on a machine, he's supported, right? His back is supported, right? So when he's doing this, right, he's burning some calories for sure. He's using these deltoid muscles, but he's kind of just using his deltoids and triceps exclusively. He's not really using it. His core doesn't have to work very hard. There's not a lot else going on. But then there's the standing version here. When it's like, okay, well, now he's standing. His deltoids are still working. His triceps are still working. Now he's using his core a little bit. He's engaging his glutes, hamstrings, right? All of that. That's pretty good. But, it's not like these things are contracting that hard. And then there's like the single leg shoulder press here, where like she's standing on one leg, which means her glute has to squeeze pretty hard. She has to engage her core like crazy. She's got to stabilize while she's doing this. So that affects calorie burn. Now, obviously, you wouldn't want to do an exercise somebody's incapable of doing. But if you have a client who comes to you and they're like, hey, I want to lose a lot of weight, our priority should be to focus on calorie burn, which means we're going to pick whichever version of a shoulder exercise or whatever version of an exercise we're picking burns the most calories. So when somebody asks me, hey, should I do, this is sort of the classic sort of amateur question that people will ask. They'll say, hey, which shoulder exercise should I do? Should I do the machine? Should I do the barbell? Or should I do like a single leg? Which one's best? None of them are best. They're all just good at very specific things. The machine one's really good if you're trying to increase like maximum strength and you don't have a spotter. The barbell one's really good for maximum strength, but also very good for hypertrophy. And the single leg one is really good for focusing on stabilization and burning lots of calories. So which one is best? It doesn't really work that way. It depends on what your goals are, right? It's definitely going to depend on like how you want your body to develop, what things you want to get good at. There is no best, same thing with diets. I never tell anybody. People are always asking, like, what's the best diet I can do? I'm like, there is no best diet. Whichever one works for you the most effectively and fuels you for the way you live your life, that's what's best. But like, there isn't just like a flat best one out there, it depends. Like, what cereal is best? It's like, it depends. Do you want to save money or do you want to eat something tasty? I don't care about the taste of cereal all that much. So I eat the knockoff brand stuff that's from the cheap. Like, my girlfriend, she likes, the real stuff. They're just different. Like for me, what's important is the money aspect. For her, what's important is the taste. There's no real right answer here, right? It's the same thing with exercises, but you do want to know what's going on physiologically with those exercises, and you want to pick the one that's closely related to your client's goal. If this was Eddie Hall, he doesn't need to do a single leg shoulder press. He's a big, strong dude. He's going to focus more on just lifting the barbell version. Very stable, all of them are good. So that's a little bit about what we know about like burning energy, and that'll become really important at the very end of this mod. We'll be talking about like how to burn the most amount of energy during your workouts, then like get a little bit of a sneaky extra calorie burn going during our workouts. We'll talk about that at the end of the module when we get to our weight loss class. Now, here's another really cool thing. Like I said, getting back to this little chart that we started over here. We said that intensity and duration have an inverse relationship, right? As intensity goes up, duration has to go down. You can flip these two, right? As duration goes up, intensity can come down, right? Faster you sprint, the less time you're going to sprint, right? Or like the longer you run, the less speedy you will be. One of the things that we're going to look at is, and this is the real key here, Alexia, this is the best answer to your question. One of the biggest things that we're going to focus on when it comes to calorie burn is this concept right here that I put in bold: excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, aka EPOC, EPOC. This is like one of my all-time favorite things to talk about. And this is actually talking about how, what's really great about exercise, guys? When you burn calories in the gym, it's awesome that you burn calories while you were there. But what's really way better than that? The fact that your body will then continue to burn extra calories even after you leave the gym. That's awesome, right? Because what happens is, remember, when you do exercise, you are burning through all that glycogen, you're burning through any of your oxygen source, you're burning through all of this, you're using those resources. And then after you're done, your body has to go, holy crap, all of our energy stores are low. We got to refill those things. So it works a little bit harder in the hours following your workout. In fact, they've tracked this stuff. Excess post-exercise oxygen consumption can be increased for up to 72 hours post-workout. It gets really low by the end of those 72 hours, but still, like when you leave the gym, your body is still metabolizing like crazy from the work that you just did. So, but here's the thing, your intensity is very low. So excess post-exercise oxygen consumption is where oh, hold on. Can you guys hear me? Sorry, my internet told me it was crapping out.
Yeah, you can hear you now. You keep going in and out.
Okay, sorry guys. So excess post-exercise oxygen consumption is the body will continue to burn an elevated amount of calories in response to, now you'll notice we did say intense exercise. So the harder you work intensity-wise, the more likely you are to develop more EPOC. So that's one of the reasons why we have an incentive to work a little bit harder when we're in the gym. So we kind of like it when this intensity arrow is really, really high. The higher the intensity arrow is, the more calories I'm going to burn later, right? So let's take a look at another concept here and then circle back around to this. So one of the other things that we know about calorie burns, right, is we got to look at what's called your respiratory quotient. This is known as your RQ. We talked about this at the beginning of this course. It's the amount of carbon dioxide exhaled versus the amount of oxygen inhaled, or the amount of oxygen or CO2 expired versus the amount of oxygen consumed. So right now, you guys are probably mostly at rest. So you're probably at an RQ of about 0.7. So if you bring in 100 units of oxygen, you're probably consuming about 70% of it. And then the remaining 30% just gets exhaled. You don't use it, right? Because you're not really doing all that much work. Now, if you were sprinting right now as hard as you can, and you need to supply your muscles with oxygen, then chances are, let's say you're bringing in, and now you're breathing hard too, by the way. Let's say you went from bringing in 100 units of oxygen, now you're bringing in 1,000 units of oxygen. Well, you're not at an RQ of 70%. You're not at 70% of that 1,000 anymore. Now you are at 100%. So you are bringing in 1,000 units of oxygen. You are exhaling 1,000 units of CO2. All of it's getting consumed. There's no leftover oxygen because you're working so hard. Okay. So at rest, we're at an RQ of about 0.7, and fat is our primary fuel source. So here's what's cool about this, right? As intensity climbs, the ratio of fat calories is also going to climb. I'm sorry. As intensity climbs, the ratio of carbohydrate calories is going to climb. Ratio of carbohydrates burned as fuel. Okay. As intensity climbs, the ratio of carbohydrates as a fuel source is also going to go up. And as the intensity declines, the ratio of fat is going to go up. Ratio of fats burned as fuel are going to go up. So when your intensity is really high, right over here, you are burning mostly carbohydrates for fuel. Now you might be thinking, well, that's not what I want to do. I want to burn fat for fuel. I don't care how many carbs I burn through. I want to lose the love handles, you know? I want to burn fat for fuel. Okay, great. Absolutely, right? Well, here's the thing. You are burning 100% fat when you're at an RQ of 0.7. When you're an RQ of 1.0, that's 100% oxygen in, 100% CO2 out. Carbohydrates are the primary fuel source. Okay, so the rest of this chart over here, I'm going to put this actually down a little. Let's put this over here. So now as the carbohydrates sort of go up, right, and we'll put this in the arrow here. This is what happens here. This is where I just need a little bit less space, a little bit higher. There we go. So as the percentage of carbohydrate fuel goes up, your RQ is going up. This is where your intensity is really high, right? So this is high intensity exercise is an RQ of 1.0. 100% of the oxygen is being used for energy. So that's great and all. And then obviously, like when our intensity is really low, we're going to see something like this. And that is going to be low intensity exercise is an RQ of 0.7. And that's where 70% of the oxygen is being used and 30% is unused because intensity is So low intensity exercise is so gentle that your body doesn't really have to work that hard. Now you might be thinking, well, great. I want to burn carbohydrates. I want to burn fat as a fuel source. Well, here's the thing. These two are associated together, right? High intensity means lots of carbohydrates as a fuel. Low intensity means lots of fat as a fuel. Now, when you hear that, that might lead you to start thinking, oh, well, then I only want to exercise at a low intensity, right? Because again, I want to burn fat, right? That's what we think of when we think of like steady state cardio. Okay, steady state slow cardio burns some fat as a fuel source, right? But the problem is you don't burn very many calories. So go back to our intensity and duration. Your duration can go up, but your intensity is going to have to drop down. So you won't be burning very many calories. And that's not great, right? So here's the thing, guys. Here's the best way to think about it. There is one time a day where you are burning fat strictly as a fuel source. You are burning 100% fat per day, once a day. And it is when you are asleep. You're not burning very many calories when you're asleep. I don't want you to go to the gym and take a nap. You know, it's like go to the gym and take a nap. You're like, and it's like, what are you doing? It's like, I'm burning fat. That is scientifically accurate, but you're not burning very much fat, right? So you might have heard in, sometimes you'll see in gyms and stuff on treadmills, they'll have it listed as what's called the fat burning zone. You'll see the fat burning zone sometimes on treadmills. It'll tell you like what your age is and what your heart rate is and or what it should be. Let me show you here. This is a chart that represents the RQ, that's the respiratory quotient, 100% to 70%, right? And then here's the percentage of calories that are being burned from fat. Here's the percentage of calories are being burned from carbs. So if you are working at 100% max effort, you are burning no fat and you are burning strictly carbs. And when you were at like basically the least amount of effort possible, you are completely asleep in a deep, deep slumber, you are burning 100% fat and 0 calories from carbs. So we're constantly in a blend somewhere between 70 and 100% burning rate. The fat burning zone is right, well, actually it's right here. It's an RQ of about 0.84, 0.85. 53% fat, 47% carbs. That, by the way, for those of you who have been through my other program design classes, is about 65% to maybe 75% of your heart rate max. So zone 1 of NASM, 65 to 75% heart rate max, is the fat burning zone. At least that's what they call it. They call it the fat burning zone because it's a higher ratio. But here's the thing. Let's pick some fake numbers here, right? Let's say you're burning 53% of your calories from fat and 47% of your calories from carbs when you're at a ratio of 0.84 and you're burning, let's say, 300 calories per hour. So that's 300 calories per hour. And this is going to be our low intensity cardio. So actually, low intensity cardio, right? That's steady state cardio is what we often call that. So that's this example here. That's an RQ of about 0.84. That's 53% fat burned, 47% carbs burned, and we burn 300 calories per hour. I'm saying 300 is a fake number. I'm just picking that number out of the blue. Okay, so now that's your low intensity cardio. Let's go to a high intensity cardio next. Let's say you're doing some sprints, right? But you can't really keep those sprints up because the intensity is so high. So you have to like slow back down, but you do rounds of it. You go sprint, you get out of breath, you recover, you sprint, you get out of breath, you recover, right? So now you're doing high intensity interval training, right? Or HIIT is what we often call it, high intensity interval training. So now you're at an RQ of about, let's say, anywhere from 1.0 to let's say we recover at 0.84, 0.84, right? So you're in a blend somewhere in between those two, right? And let's say you're doing a 60-second sprint, 60-second recovery, right? So that's gonna that 1.0 to 0.84, that's gonna average out to 0.92. 0.92 average. Okay, so now let's look at our chart. 0.92 is going to be 26% of the calories are fat, 74% of the calories are carbohydrates. Okay, so now that's what I say, 26 and 70, 26% fat burned and 74% carbs burned. So now you might be thinking, God, that's not very much fat. And you'd be right, but here's the thing. Now you are burning, let's say, 800 calories per hour. So what that comes out to is going to be 53% of 300 is 159. And 0.47 times 300 is going to be 141. So I burned 159 fat calories and 141 carb calories. I kept my ratio of fat higher than my ratio of carbs. But over here, I burned way more calories per hour in my second example. So let's see what that kind of translates into, right? So that's going to that's going to be 800 times 0.26, which is 208 fat calories, and 800 times 0.74, 592 carb calories. So obviously, I burned a higher ratio of fat over here, right? This is a higher ratio of fat, but I burned more fat calories here. And here's the other thing. I also tapped into 592 carb calories. So guess what? When I leave the gym and I go eat dinner and it's got some potatoes or rice or bread or whatever, you know what the first 592 carbohydrates are going to become? They're going to become glycogen. They have no risk at being converted into fat. So by working at a high intensity, I burned more calories, including fat calories, and my carbohydrates that I did burn through, which were my primary source, they've got to get restored before my body will ever consider converting any extra carbohydrates to fat. So maybe I've got room for a candy bar. Maybe. I mean, again, I'll probably eat something healthier than a candy bar, but I could eat it and my body would go, wow, we just got a whole bunch of sugar. You know what? Put that on the legs as glycogen because we did a bunch of cardio earlier. And it won't say, wow, we got a bunch of sugar stored as fat, right? That's awesome. This is why trainers love HIIT training so much. We love high intensity interval training because it consumes more oxygen and burns more calories. Yeah, it's not the fat burning zone. In fact, you're out of the fat burning zone on purpose, but it does burn a higher percentage of fat. This is why you'll hear people say, if I look up fat burning zone, you Google this, and you'll hear about it all the time. You'll see, if I go to Google Images, I'm sure. Oh man, I'm not gonna see what I thought I was gonna see. you will see articles and stuff like that, and it's in your textbook. Yeah, you'll see like the truth about the fat burning zone. You'll see why the fat burning zone is kind of a myth, actually. No sweat, Alexia. We're done in like 10 seconds. Yeah, I hear you. So the fat burning zone is kind of a myth, honestly. People hear it and they go, oh, that's how I burn fat. It is how you burn a higher percentage of fat, but you're not burning very many calories. Now, let's go back to that epoch that I talked about earlier, because it's going to come back and follow this as well. So here's one of the other benefits of working at a high intensity. When you burn through your oxygen stores, you burn through your glycogen stores, when you work really hard, you get a big hormonal response. Your body will burn extra calories, like I said earlier, epoch, for the next 72 hours. And here's the thing, I'm willing to bet that you are going to go to bed sometime within the next 72 hours. What did I say a minute ago? When you are asleep, you are 100% in the fat burning zone. So by working hard in the gym, you generate epoch. And by generating epoch, when you go to sleep, you will burn more calories in your sleep than you did if you had been at rest the entire time. So this is why I always tell people, and this is my favorite like fake dirty joke, by the way. I tell this to my clients all the time, and they always laugh. Burning calories in the gym is good, but burning calories in bed is better. And you guys can interpret that sentence however you want. But that's the benefit here. The harder you work, the more calories you will burn over the next 72 hours. When you go to sleep, you'll burn more calories in your fat. So now, go back to sleeping. Let's say you're burning like 100 calories per hour. It's a strictly fat calorie burn because you are not doing cardio, you're not doing any work, you're asleep, right? That's why we like HIIT training. They've done studies where they've taken two groups of people and they made them both burn 500, they burn the same number of calories, 500 calories. One group did steady state cardio, the other one did HIIT training, and they did it for 6 weeks. The group that did HIIT training burned more fat overall, even though they burned less fat in the gym. And it was because they were burning calories outside of the gym, whereas the other group wasn't, thanks to epoch. Alexia, that is how you boost your metabolism. So that's what we're trying to do, right? So bioenergetics is the study of how all of this works. I know we've talked ATP to death over the last couple of weeks. Metabolism is all the chemical reactions. It is using proteins, carbs, and fats for energy. And then your RQ, your respiratory quotient, the ratio between those numbers, right? We see that in our notes here, is the ratio between carbs being burned when you're sprinting and fat being burned when you're resting. We are typically at some blend between those two. When you're working out, we want to get as close to a high RQ as possible. We want to mostly burn carbs in the gym, which seems kind of surprising, but the benefit is that you work harder and you get a bigger calorie burn over the next 72 hours. It will result in more fat burned overall. You know, it's like investing. You know, it's like, I wish I had that $1,000, but when it becomes $1,200, I'm going to be happy. You know, like, questions, comments, concerns, guys. If you want to, like I said, everybody read chapter 4 of the pink push-up textbook, your regular standard NASM 6th edition. Read that chapter 4 and it will explain, it'll review everything I just talked about. But any questions today, guys? Simon, Dion, Joseph, David, Chris, Alexia, how are all of you guys feeling?
Good. I'm good.
Cool.
Good as well.
All right, cool. Well, I'll go ahead and kill the recording.